As we thank dads today for their love and kindness, I'm reminded of the recent Lowe's commercials about life lessons we receive from our dad or our father figure. Statements that shaped our ideas and way of life. Statements like, if it's worth doing, then it's worth doing right. Measure twice and cut once. Practice makes good habits. Surround yourself with great people and keep good company. And always know your audience. This is especially true today with emails and texting. For example, this week I received an email from a friend with sensitive banking information that was not supposed to be sent to me. Delete, delete, delete. And then on the same day, I received a text from a different friend that clearly was not meant for me. I now know what she calls her husband. Though I confess, I've sent a text or two or perhaps three to the wrong person. So even I know, and even I am still working on knowing who I'm texting before I hit send. Thankfully, the people who received my text messages were gracious. But what happens when vital information is needed, but we don't communicate it to others well? That's the scenario someone provided in the following fictional account. As the story goes, a priest and a pastor from two local congregations were standing by the side of the road, holding up a sign that read, "The end is near. Turn yourself around before it's too late." A driver saw the sign and yelled from his car as he passed them, "Leave us alone, you religious nuts!" With that, the driver accelerated and zoomed around the curve, which was immediately followed by the sound of screeching tires and a big splash. The priest looked over at the pastor and said, "Do you think we should just change the sign to say, 'The bridge is out'?" Whoops. No doubt about it. It is important we know what language to use to communicate vital information. This is especially true when it comes to talking to others about our faith and about God. In a New York Times article, religion writer Jonathan Merritt reported that although 70% of Americans identify as Christian, a lot of us don't feel comfortable speaking about God or about our faith. He shares that in a recent Barna survey, only a mere 7% say they talk about spiritual matters on a regular basis. Some observers are not surprised by these findings, but what was shocking was that those who claim they attended church on a regular basis didn't do much better than the general population about having conversations about God. Jonathan states that today work often takes precedence over worship, social lives are prioritized over spiritual disciplines, and generally speaking, most people who responded to the survey said they feel conflicted about talking openly about their faith because their conversations about God creates tensions and arguments. Talking about religion has become too political. A smaller group of respondees said they don't do God talk because they aren't sure what words to use, or that their religious talk might make them sound like extremists or cause them to sound weird, as though they were speaking a different language. That certainly is a challenge when communicating with unchurched persons, especially when it comes to using terms like liturgy or liturgical screens, or perhaps using words like nave and chancel, which are familiar to us, may sound unfamiliar and odd to others. In addition, the use of some religious phrases and words can be mystifying. Words like tithes or love offering. Reverend J.R. Briggs writes of this experience when he announced during worship they were taking a love offering, and some visitors who had no church background looked at each other alarmed and perplexed, wondering what on earth kind of church they just walked into that wanted a love offering. Since then, Reverend Briggs says he's careful to not use insider religious phrases which might mystify unchurched persons or might cause them to tune out rather than to tune in. Fortunately, it appears Paul knew the risk of losing his audience if he used insider language or spoke about church polity instead of speaking clearly about life in God's family. Paul addressed the community's desire to belong and be loved by God, writing that we are God's children when we let love be genuine, hate what is evil, hold fast to what is good, love one another with mutual affection, outdo one another in showing honor. He adds, being led by the Spirit, we are guided toward God-centered living, which means we rejoice in hope, exercise patience in suffering, and extend hospitality to strangers. Paul realized that his Roman audience would easily recognize these concepts of love, honor, hope, perseverance, and hospitality, and his audience would be willing to engage in dialogue about these because these concepts were deemed important to life. For Paul, dogma and church polity could wait. His focus was on helping persons engage in God talk, even if they weren't aware they were speaking it. The reason Paul did this is that he saw conflict arising in the early church between the Hebrews and the Gentiles. Essentially, it was a debate over old structures and traditions versus a new way of understanding God. Some early Christians still viewed God as an exclusive God. Thus, anyone who were recent converts to Christianity or were born of Gentile parents, though they could call themselves Christians, it was believed they were not God's chosen. The debate centered on who joined the church first, or who held membership the longest, or actually studied with the disciples. And it was believed by those in the in-group they held a special place in God's heart. Paul argued that this belief did not matter to the life of the church because it created a group of insiders which naturally led to a group of outsiders. Secondly, in his view, this distinction of who was in or out was too focused on living in the flesh and not living in the Spirit of God. Paul reaffirmed that everyone had been chosen by God, declaring that we are all loved by God, for God so loved the whole world. And he insists we are all heirs to God's kingdom based on Jesus' declaration that we are his brothers and we are his sisters. With this proclamation, Paul reminded the early church that God adopted all of us. And since we are adopted into God's family, the relationship between all of us is permanently changed, as it is changed with God. God is no longer some foreign entity or some vindictive, power-crazed God who desires to inflict harm upon us, whether in this life or the one to come. Rather, since we are adopted by God, we are loved by God. This new way of thinking about God reassured the church and reassures us that we are permanently grafted into God's family. Paul utilized the concept of adoption because it wasn't mysterious religious jargon. Rather, it was an easily understood concept because Paul's Roman audience knew that within the Roman Empire, it was expected that when someone did not have a child to pass their name or property on to, they would adopt someone. And it wasn't just children being adopted in those days. No matter what someone's age, they could be adopted by a Roman citizen. In addition, like today, according to the Roman adoption code, when an adopted person is taken in, then they are granted full legal rights of their adoptive parent. In the Roman situation, they inherited the estate, the family name, and the political status of their family. Being adopted by God essentially means that we are heirs of God and joint heirs with Christ. A biblical studies professor, Richard Carlson, writes that as heirs of God, we are fully conformed to the glorious image of God that exists in God's Son. However, being adopted in the family does not mean that we will receive instant luxury or ease. Rather, it means that we receive love, hope, and hospitality from God. Receiving these treasures, we in turn offer these valuable gifts to others as we follow Jesus' example to be hospitable, caring, and hopeful people. As adopted children, we can also speak to God. Perhaps this concept seems a bit mysterious at first. However, Paul repeated the title Jesus used to address God when he prayed, saying, Abba. And though this word is typically translated as father in Aramaic, the word actually is closer to the use of dad or daddy. Paul's use of this intimate word suggests that the early church was using it to address God, and thus we have permission to use it as well. And by addressing God as Abba or Daddy, this allows us to recognize our adoption and our close relationship with God. By addressing God as a child would address a parent. This was to help people experience a new identity, especially as they navigated a dysfunctional world and actually might be part of a dysfunctional family. Adopted by God, they could discover a new family of caring people who valued love, honor, hope, and hospitality, and valued sharing these with others. Unfortunately, linguistically, love has become overused, so that the word love is used to describe our sentiments for a new car, a television show, a slice of pizza. And words like honor and hospitality have practically disappeared, along with modesty, compassion, and kindness. And as these concepts disappear, so our entire culture suffers, as we've seen with the mistreatment of women and the ugly statements said about our sisters and our daughters, or how in some churches today the title for God, particularly the gender imagery for God, which is forced upon both men and women to see God exclusively as a male. That was not Paul's intent. Paul was very careful with the language he used. And when he repeated Jesus' address of God, he did so because no one had ever thought of God as a parent before. And secondly, Paul's use of Abba was an invitation to the community to realize that through the Holy Spirit, they had a close kinship with God in a powerful and incredible way. Paul never meant that God would or should be referred to with such an exclusive term as Father, especially if doing so caused harm or alienated people or hurt by using male imagery for God. After all, not everyone grew up in homes with admirable father figures. Therefore, it's difficult for some folks, both men and women, to refer to God as Father, just as some of us may refuse to call God Daddy because perhaps it sounds too intimate or fails to show God respect, or perhaps the title is strange or silly or painful. As a caring body of believers who recognize the ability for our words to offer healing and have the power to harm, it is our responsibility to use language, even when it comes to Abba or Father or Dad, to address God carefully. This doesn't mean we can't use this language or this imagery. It simply means that as a family in God, we should be aware of how our God talk might be received or what impact it has on others. In addition, instead of being so focused on forcing a type of correctness on others about how to address God, we ought to share from our own experiences and lovingly, with compassion and kindness, be willing to hear the experiences of others and honor those experiences with respect and consideration, just as we hear with love and compassion the experiences of others. A few weeks ago, at the Detroit Metro Association spring meeting, a young millennial attended and shared her painful experiences with the male imagery that's used for God. And she says she copes simply by shutting out the rest of the message. She often leaves before the service ends because it's uncomfortable language. However, she added that she's open to discussing how she can remain part of the community. She just needs to know an effort is being made so that our God talk can meet her where she is through our shared relationship. Recognizing that each of us has a different experience with dad or a father figure, this allows us to be together in family while also allowing us to remain thankful for our own experiences. Just as I'm thankful for my dad and my grandfather because of my experiences, even when viewed differently by others at the time. For example, when I was 6 or 7 years old, my dad was teaching at a local high school, and there was a student who took exception at a grade he earned on a test my dad had administered. Angry, the student found our home and threw a number of large rocks at our front window. I happened to be on the other side of that window when it broke, and large glass fragments deeply lacerated my arm. Though my dad was encouraged to press charges against the student or have him expelled from school, my dad exercised great restraint and forgave the youth for his lapse of judgment. Whereas others may view this action as a failure of his family, I actually had a different view. I saw him as a hero, after all. He's the one who moved quickly and was also injured by the falling broken glass. It was also my dad who quickly bandaged my arm and rushed me to the emergency room so I could get my first pair of stitches. My dad often spoke about compassion and grace when tested. And when tested, he walked the talk. And he provided a life lesson for me, so that every time I look at my elbow, I am reminded that ugly things happen because we live in a dysfunctional world. But in my case, the love my father displayed and his actions of compassion, even towards someone who caused harm, reminds me of the type of loving grace we receive from God who adopts us and allows Jesus Christ to be our brother. Encouraged by this imagery, when we speak of love, honor, hope, and hospitality, I am encouraged that we can back up our words with actions that the whole world, even if they don't speak our language, even if they choose to tune us out, or our God talk causes them to ignore us, they will still, in some way, get the message, because they will still see our values practiced and lived, all because Abba God has adopted us and calls us beloved and chosen. And so even though I say Happy Father's Day, I hope you have a parent who comes to your mind that you can thank today for the God talk you've learned and the lessons you've gained, so that together we praise God for these role models in our lives who've adopted us into God's wonderful family. We give thanks and praise.